Does archaeology support the Bible? If so, how?
Today, we are reviewing Sean McDowell's interview with Dr. Titus Kennedy regarding archaeology that supports the Old Testament. This video caught my eye because it was Sean's dad's claim in this book that no archaeological find has ever contradicted anything in the Bible that helped trap me for decades into thinking the Bible was inerrant. No reasonable person who has ever made even a cursory glance at recent archaeology, and by recent I mean in the last 50 years, could make such a claim today, and Dr. Kennedy does not. But unlike Josh McDowell, who is in the position of using archaeology to prove that the Bible is inerrant, Sean here finds himself in the position of trying to defend the Bible from all the archaeology that would show the Bible to be in error in multiple respects. So Dr. Kennedy says that he has found some evidence that will support the claims of the Bible. But the real question here should be, is it enough to support the Bible being the infallible word of an omniscient God? That is a tall order indeed. If, after seeing his evidence, the conclusion that we come to is that some of the events described in the Bible might have happened, or that they did happen but not exactly as described, I don't think you can. So can he get us there? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Today, we are looking at Sean McDowell as he interviews Dr. Titus Kennedy, archaeologist and research fellow at the Discovery Institute. He writes articles and books about biblical archaeology and history. That bio is from his own website, which also shows that his PhD is in literature and philosophy. So neither history nor archaeology are his field. I don't know what his master's degrees are in. There is very little about him on the internet. His two books are both published by Christian publishers and are intended not as academic works, but are intended as religious literature. I don't know if he's going to present his own research here, analyze the work of other researchers, or a bit of both.
We'll follow your lead, Star-Lord.
Bitterbow!
Let's see what evidence he has to see if it supports a belief in the historical claims of the Old Testament.
Passages in the Old Testament better. So I wanted to give a little bit of both of those sides of biblical archaeology.
Well, let's dive in and do that very thing. Let's start with number one, Atrahasis. What is that find?
Atrahasis is an ancient story, an epic or a myth it might be called, from Mesopotamia. And in particular, this was recorded on clay tablets. Now, the Atrahasis story mostly contains a flood story with a little bit of a creation time prelude. But fairly recently, the oldest tablet of Atrahasis was rediscovered, so to speak, by the British Museum. It was brought in by a private collection. And when the curator was reading it, he noticed some lines from it that had not appeared on some of the other Atrahasis tablets. And in particular, there was one talking about bringing the animals onto the boat 2 by 2. And so he saw the immense importance of this, and he asked the owner if he could hold on to the tablet and translate it. So he went through, he made the translation of this new tablet and found out it was actually from about 1900 BC. It was older than all the other Atrahasis tablets. And it was also the closest of any of the other flood stories to the Noah account in Genesis. And so what this shows us, at the very least, is that people way back in the time of Abraham knew about the flood story and had essentially the same details in their story as what was recorded about Noah in the book of Genesis, just showing us the antiquity of the account of the flood, and that people from various parts of the ancient world agreed that there was some kind of flood event with a man in a boat who was saved.
Dr. Kennedy's claim is that the Noah story was known in and around the time of Moses. This is not news. The Epic of Gilgamesh predates the Noah story by several centuries and has been known for some time to include elements of the Noah story. Now let's look at the flood story of Atrahasis. It says, "The lesser gods, tired of their labors on the canals and farms of Mesopotamia, and instigated a rebellion. Enlil, the god of the sky and earth, wanted to punish these gods, but Enki, the god of the waters, argued that humans should be created to do the work instead. The womb goddess, Nintu, was appointed to create humankind by mixing clay with the blood of a junior god who was killed as a sacrifice. However, human overpopulation soon became a problem. Enlil sent various disasters to diminish humankind, but Enki persistently foiled his plans. Finally, Enlil determined to send a flood to kill all humans, and Enki warned the faithful Atrahasis of the plan. Atrahasis then built a boat and saved his family and animals. Enlil was furious at Enki for ruining his plan, but they agreed to devise a new way to control human population. Nintu arranged that 1 out of every 3 children born would die, and certain priestesses would be celibate. The New World Encyclopedia also notes that King Atrahasis is listed in the Sumerian king list as one of the monarchs who lived before the deluge, but his historicity cannot otherwise be confirmed. And Atrahasis is an 18th century BCE Akkadian epic named after its human hero. It contains both a creation myth explaining how the gods created humankind and an early flood account that was later incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh and is also thought to have influenced the biblical flood story. In this article, Kennedy says that the recent discovered portion was found in 2009, so about 13 years ago. He notes several differences between this account and the Noah account. Others are that the boat was round in this story, though he doesn't mention that that aligns more with the Gilgamesh version. This version has 7 days of rain. Similarities include that there were 2 of each animal taken, and afterward a sacrifice is made. However, here the gods eat the sacrifice. I'm wondering if the sacrificed animals are now extinct. Maybe that's what really happened to the dinosaurs. The gods ate them. But seriously, Kennedy seems most impressed that the oldest known flood story comes from the Mesopotamia area, indicating that that will coincide with humanity being wiped out and a new wave of humans spreading out from there. But is this possible? No, not really. Genetics tells us that our most recent common Y chromosome ancestor most definitely came from Africa, not Mesopotamia.
The argument they make is that they say, well, it's not about out of Africa. The consensus view of human evolution and migration, we started in sub-Saharan Africa and then radiated throughout the rest of the world from there. They say it's not that. It's this other model called instantaneous divergence, and it's actually centered on the Middle East, not sub-Saharan Africa. None of that is correct. Is that there's 4 lines of evidence that 100% demonstrate it's out of Africa. One is just raw genetic diversity. There's more diversity within Africa than outside of Africa, and it's distant dependent, right? So the closer you are essentially to like Ethiopia, the more diverse that population is, just raw diversity. Second is heterozygosity, so diversity at a specific locus. How many different versions of a specific gene do you have? Again, there's a distant dependent pattern radiating from sub-Saharan Africa. Third, linkage equilibrium, which is a measure of how well mixed your genome is. Is this specific sequence over here correlated with this one over here, or are they essentially uncorrelated with each other, right? The longer a large population has been intermixed, you are at a higher degree of equilibrium. We find the most equilibrium in sub-Saharan Africa, and as you leave Africa, you get more and more disequilibrium. And again, it's distant dependent. So like outside of Africa, you find the most equilibrium in the Middle East, and then kind of like Central Asia, and then East Asia, and then the Americas, right? It's distant dependent in a very predictable pattern. The fourth and final thing, which is like if you look at the specific variation, not the amount of variation or equilibrium or anything, but if you look at these specific sequences that you find all over the world in different human populations, what you find is that you make a phylogeny of it, and every population that's not inside of Africa nests inside of the clade of African sequences. There's no way to interpret that other than everyone descended from the common ancestor of that clade. And using the other genetic evidence that I just went through, we can point to where that ancestor came from, sub-Saharan Africa. That's the ball game. Thanks for playing. Humans came from sub-Saharan Africa. We all evolved from an ancestral population in sub-Saharan Africa, and then we radiated throughout the rest of the world. Period. There's more fun stuff to talk about with this.
Answers in Genesis is working on trying to push this to Mesopotamia so that the flood story can have some plausibility. But this video by Erica Gutsick-Gibbon explains why they fail miserably. Kennedy seems to work from the conclusion that the Bible is right and then tries to find evidence to support that conclusion. If Kennedy's primary reason for saying that the flood story is true is because the oldest flood story comes from the same general region as that of the Noah story, what will he do if in the future an older flood story is found in China or South America or India? In fact, one may already have. The Shatapatha Brahmana does contain a flood story, in which Manu is the hero that builds the boat. The oldest current copies of this text date to about 700 BCE. Experts date the original writing style to about 800 to 1000 BCE, and they say that they describe astronomical events from the 4th millennium BCE. So this flood story could predate all of the Mesopotamia legends. It would put the flood at the same time as young earthers put creation. If such evidence was found that these stories predate even when the Noah flood was supposed to have happened, what would that do to your evidence, to your faith?
So why is this find significant?
Well, this one bolsters the credibility of the Noah narrative in Genesis, and really we could say to the overall story of Genesis. Because Genesis is so far back in time, obviously, we don't have as much archaeological material for many of the accounts in there. The different people and the events, you just lose that over time. And we can see a progression as we go forward in time through the Old Testament, that the closer we get to the present day, usually the more material remains we still have left over. But the writings of Moses and Genesis are very, very criticized, especially the patriarchal period, as being a late invention and really anachronistic, not based on historical reality. But this is something that tells us, at the very least, people knew about this flood story, this one man who built a boat and was saved from it. It wasn't just a creation or even a copy of the Israelites from much later.
I don't think Kennedy understands the criticism. Either that or he just ducks the real questions that are raised. The criticism isn't that the Genesis stories didn't exist until about 700 BCE, but that they weren't written down until then. Thus, the claim that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, can't be accurate. These stories were likely passed down from generation to generation for who knows how long before they were written. That's exactly the problem. We don't know how old the prehistoric stories are. That they would be anachronistic when written is what we would expect from writing down an ancient oral tradition. But the fact that the stories also contain elements that date them to a much later time period is clear evidence that they were not written from the time of Moses.
Archaeological discovery number 2, the Code of Hammurabi. What does this find?
The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most famous ancient law codes, and it was commemorated on a stele, a large stele. This has a lot of things we could talk about, but for the purposes of my book, what I discussed in there had to do with the social customs of the patriarchs, and in particular, a slave price in the Joseph story. So the Code of Hammurabi has some things that match up to the social customs of the time of the patriarchs, like the choice of the firstborn, even when he's not chronologically born first. Think of Ishmael and Isaac, for example. But there's a really important section there. Actually, 3 of the laws talk about the price of a slave in the 18th century BC when this was written. And if we look at the Joseph story in Genesis chapter 37, we see that he was sold for 20 shekels of silver. Now, that may seem like a useless detail that's in the biblical text there. Well, if we go and then we look at the time of Joseph, we see that's right around this time of the Code of Hammurabi, and we match those up, we see they have exactly the same price for a slave. And that's important because the prices changed over time. If we go earlier, we're going to see 5 shekels of silver, then 10 shekels of silver. You finally get to 20. To the time of Moses, it's 30. And then you go on to the divided kingdom period, and it's 50. So they were changing over time. This tells us that the element of the Joseph story here about the price of slaves is absolutely accurate for the time period in which the Bible places Joseph.
There is a couple major flaws in his claim here. First, I want to say thank you for acknowledging that the Code of Hammurabi predates Moses by at least 400 years. Many of the 10 Commandments are in the Code of Hammurabi. Evidently, Yahweh wasn't very creative, as he had to copy from the Code of Hammurabi. Next, Kennedy claims that if more evidence could be found of the price of a slave, we would find that earlier it would be a lower price. He asserts that not only with no supporting evidence, but the admission that such evidence doesn't currently exist. He only assumes that if such evidence is found in the future, it will support him. Except that's not how economics works. While we do, in our culture, generally see the prices of goods and services steadily increasing, with only a few exceptions of economic downturn to indicate a period of deflation, that doesn't mean that this applies to all cultures for all times. Supply and demand are what determines the prices of goods. More importantly, let's look at what he says about this confirming the Bible. Now, if, from the time of Joseph to the time of Moses, 400 years, the price of a slave went from 20 shekels to 30 shekels, then in the time of David, about 400 years later, the price of a slave is then 50 shekels. Then in Jesus' day, 1,000 years later, we would expect the price of a slave to be about 75 shekels of silver, if it's a steady 10 shekels per 400 years. Yet we are told that Jesus was sold for the price of a slave, 30 shekels of silver. How did the price of a slave manage to drop from David's day to Jesus' day? Now, the Bible doesn't specifically say that the price of a slave in that day was the price that Jesus was sold for, and this article indicates that the price of a slave at that time was 600 denarii, which translates to about 200 shekels. But in reality, the price of a slave will vary with the economy. Another article indicated a primary factor was the cost to catch the slave. The point is, the price of a slave in the Code of Hammurabi being less than that of the slave in a Mosaic law is no more confirmation that the Old Testament is true than the price of bread in 1920 being confirmation of the outcome of the 2020 election.
Archaeological discovery number 3, the Papyrus Brooklyn. What is this?
Papyrus Brooklyn is an Egyptian papyrus from what's called the Second Intermediate Period. It roughly dates to the 17th century BC. So it's also approximately from the time of Joseph, or maybe just after his life and just before Moses. This was found in southern Egypt in the Thebes area, and it's a list of household servants or household slaves. Now, that may not seem like a very interesting thing. It's just some list of people working in houses. But when the names were analyzed, we saw that many of the names were Semitic names, and then they were given a new Egyptian name. But even more specifically, several of these names are actually biblical Hebrew names. Some are feminine forms of masculine names that we're familiar with, like Jacob and Menahem and Asher. But we also have the name Shiphrah, which appears on this, and she's one of the Hebrew midwives mentioned in Exodus 1. We have all these Hebrew names popping up in Egypt prior to the Exodus. This is significant because it demonstrates there were people with Hebrew names, Hebrews.
I'm stopping him there as I'm aware of no one that claims that there were no Hebrew slaves in Egypt at this time. I have heard this claim from believers who, like Kennedy here, then turn around and say, but wait, here is evidence of a few Hebrew slaves in Egypt. The problem isn't that we don't think there were any Hebrew slaves, but rather that they weren't 80% of the population. According to the Bible, there were 600,000 male slaves that left Egypt. If each had one wife and 2 kids, that's 2.4 million Hebrew slaves leaving Egypt at the Exodus. The population, not the region of the Nile Delta, but of the entire country, was about 1.5 to 2.9 million, which means either every person in the entire country left at the Exodus, or at least about 83%. Either way, evidence of a few slaves is not evidence that Hebrews made up 80% of the population. Also problematic is that the document denotes a Theban noblewoman named Senebitisi to establish legal ownership of 95 household servants whose names indicate that 45 were of Asiatic origin. The presence of so many foreigners in a single household suggests that the Asiatic population was increasing rapidly in the 13th dynasty Egypt. If only half of the servants are Asian, how can 80% of the entire population of Egypt be Hebrew? Far more problematic for the biblical account, and of course Dr. Kennedy fails to mention, is that the occupations of many of these slaves are included in the papyrus. The occupations of the servants, as tabulated by Hayes, are of the utmost interest. Of the Egyptian slaves, 3 served as housemen, 5 as field hands, 1 as a sandal maker. 1 woman was a hairdresser, and 2 women were gardeners, 1 a reciter, and 2 women probably were textile workers. The Asiatic slaves, however, had much better positions. Only 2 are listed as housemen and 1 as a field hand. But we find 1 man as a brewer, 2 as cooks, and 1 as a tutor. Of the Asiatic women slaves, 18 were employed in the manufacturing of cloth, 4 as a magazine employee, and only 1 as a laborer. This evidence indicated that most of the Egyptian slaves came from the peasant class, while the Asiatics were either professionals or craftsmen, hence seem to have come to Egypt through slave trading. Funny, none of them are making mud bricks.
Israelites living in Egypt before the time of the Exodus. And that is a major critique of the Exodus story, is that there's supposedly no evidence that Hebrews or Israelites were in Egypt before the time of the Exodus.
But were there 2.4 million of them? And were they making mud bricks? What there is no evidence of is there being a large group of Hebrews leaving Egypt and living in the desert for 40 years. How do 2.4 million people live in the desert for 40 years and leave no trace that they were ever there? I'm skipping his next point as he uses it to support a claim of a biblical translation issue, which I don't find relevant to history.
Archaeological discovery number 5, the Nomads of Yahweh inscriptions. What's this?
This is one of my favorite. I worked on a project connected to this inscription, and it's also, I think, one of the most significant finds, again, connected with the Exodus and the wandering. Now, often it's said that there's no evidence for the Israelites during the wandering period, and also we shouldn't expect much because they were living as nomads wandering through the wilderness. But there is this Egyptian inscription, which appears on a temple of the pharaoh Amenhotep III. One inscription is on a pillar and the other was on a wall. And in Egyptian hieroglyphs, it says, the land of the nomads of Yahweh. And so they were saying that there was this area east of Egypt. It's contextually placed around Moab or Edom, Transjordan, where some nomads were living, wandering, that worshiped the god Yahweh.
This one is interesting. First, it's his own original work, at least in part. Second, this is a new one to me. Let's pick it apart, shall we? In and next to an Egyptian tomb, there is an inscription about the Wanderers of Yahweh. He says it was found east of Egypt, near Moab. Here. Moab was not part of Israel or Egypt during David's reign, but it was part of Israel during Solomon's reign. When is this inscription dated to? Ah, yes, 1400 BC. So, right about the time that Moses and the Israelites are allegedly wandering in the desert, or just after they arrived in the Promised Land. If the Hebrews are escaped slaves of Egypt, why is a pharaoh of Egypt being buried right next to where they are and not recapturing them and taking them back to Egypt? Because Pharaoh lost his army in the Red Sea and he can't because these people outnumber him about 8-1? Okay, that works. But if he is the same Pharaoh that they just escaped from, the ones that destroyed his army, why does he want to be buried right next to where they are now settling? Why not in Cairo? Let's get a little more information about these inscriptions, shall we? He's referring to the Soleb inscription here. At the end of the 15th century BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III built a temple to honor the god Amun-Ra, Amun-Ra, at Soleb in Nubia. Within the temple area are a series of columns on which Amenhotep III listed the territories he claimed to have conquered. Each territory is listed by a relief of a prisoner with their hands tied behind their backs over an oval name ring identifying the land of that particular foe. The most interesting, from a biblical perspective, is a column drum that lists enemies from the land of Shasu, Nomads of Yahweh. Given the other name rings nearby, the context would place this land in the Canaanite region. In addition, the prisoner is clearly portrayed as Semitic rather than African-looking, as the other prisoners in the list are portrayed. Two conclusions are almost universally accepted. This inscription clearly references Yahweh in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the oldest such reference outside of the Bible, and that around 1400 BC, Amenhotep III knew about the god Yahweh. Moreover, it would indicate an area in Canaan in the 15th century BC inhabited by nomadic or semi-nomadic people who worship the god Yahweh. This would confirm that the Egyptians know the Israelite people and the god Yahweh, and that the people of Israel were considered nomads around the time of the alleged Exodus. What doesn't fit is this inscription saying that Egypt conquered this people group. If the biblical narrative were true, these people came to Egypt as a single family group and grew into a people group as captives. They weren't conquered, nor were they ever enemies of Egypt prior to their release. If their being enemies is supposed to be their escape, why are they depicted as being conquered and led to Egypt as captives? It could be an exaggeration or wishful thinking on the part of the Egyptians. Next, if the Exodus happened during the reign of Ramses II, and Moses and the Israelites never heard the name of Yahweh until the time of Moses, how did Amenhotep, who was Pharaoh 200 years before Moses was born, know this name? Kennedy solves this problem by putting the Exodus to an early date. The problem with this is that the Bible has the Hebrews building the city of Ramses, a city that Ramses commissioned. How can the Hebrews be building the city of Ramses if the Exodus happened in 1450, 200 years before Ramses was born? Dr. Maggie Bryson, Egyptologist, says Thutmose III was Pharaoh in 1450, the traditional date given for the Exodus, and Ramses II was Pharaoh if you go with the later date. According to Dr. Bryson, I don't know of a single Egyptologist who would tell you that the Exodus happened exactly as it's said to have happened in the Bible. Dr. Bryson's view is that there is some kernel of history to this story, most likely. There probably were people in Egypt of Hebrew origin that had a bad experience there and left, maybe altogether, then passing this story to their children and the next generation and the next. The story grows to this fantastical, miraculous account. I would agree. Very like the way the Jesus stories grow to include a resurrection and miracles that many historians, even Christian historians, say most likely didn't happen. Like when Mike Licona said that the zombies of Matthew didn't happen.
In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 27, verses 52 and 53, we have a strange little passage about when Jesus died. Not only do you have darkness and an earthquake, but you have the tombs opening up, and it said the spirits of many saints were raised, and after the resurrection they came out, walked into Jerusalem, and appeared to many. This is only told by Matthew of the four Gospels. So what are we to do with this? A lot of commentators don't really mention this or want to spend a lot of time with it. I think what's going on here, when you look at the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature of the period, that would seem to suggest that Matthew does not mean for us to understand these in a historical sense.
The pieces of evidence that Kennedy presented fit well in this scenario. There is some truth to the story. Finding evidence for pieces of it coincide with this more rational view of history. As Dr. Josh Bowen puts it, you read 6 different articles and a book, and they are all working with the same 8 data points. But they're all bringing a model that accounts for those data points differently, and it's our job to find those assumptions that connect the data points. The model that wins out the day is the one that has the least assumptions, that connecting the data points, and the one that makes the most sense and accounts for the data points in the most plausible way.
Transjordan, where some nomads were living, wandering, that worshiped the god Yahweh. Now, this tells us that the Egyptians were familiar with the name Yahweh, even the Pharaoh himself, and that tells us there must have been a connection at some point. They must have had interaction with the Israelites. Of course, the Israelites are the only people in ancient times who worship the god Yahweh. We have no evidence of anyone else ever worshiping Yahweh or making inscriptions about Yahweh. So
this statement is not entirely true. According to Thomas Romer, Bible scholar and Reformed minister, at the end of the 13th century BC, Israel's Edomite neighbors worshipped Yahweh as a god of war and storms. Yahweh arrived in Canaan where the Israelites lived, brought by a group of his nomadic worshippers. In his early days, he was just another tutelary deity, that is, a tribal protector and patron. Those that worshipped him believed he would intervene in his people's military battles and bring rain to fertilize their crops. Yahweh initially had a consort, the goddess Asherah, who was also known as the Queen of Heaven. As they often do, tragedy and devastation had a major impact on theology. After the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC, the geographical dispersion of the Israelites, there was no king, no temple, and no autonomous national entity. Yahweh could no longer be worshipped as a national god or as the tutelary deity of a royal family. Israel's humiliating defeat at the hands of a hated foe could have led it to abandon its god. It would have been natural to conclude that Israel had been defeated because the gods of Babylonia were more powerful than Yahweh. But the Bible's authors chose the opposite explanation, insisting that the temple had been destroyed because Yahweh had used the Babylonians to punish his unfaithful people. Mr. Romer explains that if Yahweh can make use of the Babylonians, that means he can control them. Therefore, he is more powerful than the gods of Babylon. This is, Mr. Romer suggests, a prelude to the monotheist idea. Ironically, then, the crushing defeat of Judea gives rise to the monotheistic insistence that its God is all-powerful and universal. The history of theology sometimes takes wild and unexpected turns. Of course, the Israelites themselves are in fact Canaanites, so one could make the argument that if Yahweh was originally an Edomite or Moabite god, they are still Canaanites as well. So I think the case can be made that he was always a Canaanite god, but not that he was exclusively an Israelite god.
It puts Yahweh worshiping wanderers, Israelites, in the place where they're supposed to be during that 40-year wandering period after the Exodus, just before the conquest. It provides us with archaeological evidence that the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, that they did worship Yahweh, and also that the Egyptians were familiar with them and the name Yahweh, which had been revealed to Moses not too long before the Exodus. And so it bolsters the historical reliability of the Exodus wandering story.
I think he tries to read too much into this inscription. To say that the followers of Yahweh were nomads does not mean that they wandered the Sinai Peninsula. It could mean that, but that is bringing a great deal of personal bias into the historical data point. The historical data point fits better and with less baggage from the standpoint that Yahweh was the God of a nomadic people group that brought the God to the Israelites. This model has far fewer assumptions and fits better with other historical finds. I actually learned a lot in making this video, not so much from a factual perspective, but more on how to analyze ancient history.
You know what I'm craving? A little perspective. That's it. I'd like some fresh, clear, well-seasoned perspective. Can you suggest a good wine to go with that?
Thank you, Dr. Josh Bowen, for this perspective. Kennedy still has a lot of evidence to go through yet, but this is enough for today. If you like this and want to see more, leave a note in the comments and I'll turn this one into a series. Otherwise, I think this perspective is enough that one can analyze the rest of his data points without a further deep dive. They likely follow a similar pattern. If we took everything that Kennedy presented today at face value, all we would have at this point is, 1. There was an early version of a flood narrative from the region of Mesopotamia. 2. There were a few Hebrew slaves in ancient Egypt. 3. Ancient Hebrews were referred to as nomads. And 4. Ancient Egyptians had heard of Yahweh. Yes, it is possible to reconcile these with the Bible. But if that is all you have, that a bit of what is in the Bible could be true, this doesn't even come close to getting you to this book being the word of an infallible, omniscient God. And that's disregarding all the discrepancies. Color me unimpressed with Kennedy's professionalism, as he clearly approached his study with a specific conclusion in mind. I have to wonder what data he had to toss aside to keep the blinders on, so he would see only what he wanted to see, or if he has seen the evidence to contradict his conclusions but just ignores that evidence. In the opening, I mentioned the real question here should be, is it enough to support the Bible being the word of an infallible, omniscient God? While Kennedy never claimed to try to answer that question, he should have. If the approach you are taking is that the Bible is inerrant, so as an archaeology, your goal is to support that, which is the approach that he has in fact taken, then the evidence should lead to this one conclusion, but it doesn't. Let me know if you want more on this one, and until then, live your life.
Well, this one bolsters the credibility of the Noah narrative in Yahweh. We have no evidence of anyone else ever worshiping Yahweh or making inscriptions about Yahweh. So